what is going on with the popularity of sleep apnea, airway issues, obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. Anything that becomes popular in medicine, dentistry, is often related, of course, to a place where people can make some money, where a laboratory can make money on appliances, where a researcher can get a grant to study it, where practitioners can make money, as we are all supposed to do, by the way, just like the lab and just like the researcher, by providing care for that. So money has something to do with anything that gains great popularity. However, airway, sleep apnea, and I'm just going to call it airway issues or airway for now, is a really interesting one because all of a sudden, in the last few years, it has become so popular to discuss and so popular to talk about who's going to do what treatment. What I mean by that is that there have been different states who have come along and someone has tried to say, for example, a dentist should not do any treatment of obstructive sleep apnea without a prescription or a diagnosis, at least, from this person or that person, be it a medical person, ENT, whatever. So we're starting to draw lines in the sand as to who should do what. Let's go back to this whole issue of airway in the first place. Why is it so popular? Well, let me say this, because I've been looking at it literally more than 25 years, because I've been in dentistry that long, and before that I was in nursing and was in critical care nursing. Let me tell you what used to happen. In the 1970s, it was still the tail end of the rite of passage as a child to usually, most children, have a TNA, tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy. That was still pretty common. It had been even more common in the 60s and even in the 50s. Why was that? Because children would have if they had big issues with a middle ear infection or with a tonsillitis, it could go into the kind of problem that ended up in encephalitis. If that broke through and got through that very thin barrier between the airway areas of the middle face and broke through to the lining of the brain, the child had encephalitis. And that actually could cause death, and did in some children. So what happened is that they realized that when a child keeps having these problems with recurrent infections and recurrent risk, then if you take out the tonsils and adenoids, which were hyperplastic and enlarging to try to deal with the infections, then often the child breathed better. They were less at risk for recurrent infections than more. Think about it, less at risk than more. And that was helpful to the child. So because it became so routine and so typical before the advent of antibiotics, this was something that happened with lots of children. Then a fellow comes along in Pennsylvania, I believe, back in the 70s, and he was a pathologist, and he had to do his publisher parish article. And he said, well, let me see, what am I going to write about? I'm a pathologist. I think I'll look at the tissues that are removed in a tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy. And I will report on what they look like. Are they infected? Are they hyperplastic? What are we seeing? So let's think for a minute. First of all, a child who was having such a procedure was not going to have the surgery when they were ill. Obviously, any smart surgeon would say, you have a fever, you have an infection, this is not a good day for your surgery, we're going to reschedule. So, not surprisingly, the pathologist discovered that the tissues were rarely infected. Yes, they were hyperplastic, but not infected. Well, somehow, along that same time, come insurance companies gaining prominence, and insurance companies took one look at that, as they are wont to do, and said, wait, this is a place where we don't have to pay for some procedures. So we're not going to approve payment for a TNA until there have been a certain number of infections, until there's some proof that it's really a big issue. And I think at the time it might have been 3 or 4 infections in a year. Well, all of a sudden, TNAs start dropping in their prominence. The procedures start dropping because the insurance companies had gotten themselves into it. And maybe that was good, maybe that was bad. So let's keep following here. So we have less procedures. We have less children having TNAs, and they do carry a risk. Any general anesthesia carries a risk. And for those of you who are pediatric dentists like myself, you know very well that every single time you put a child to sleep with general anesthesia, and certainly with sedation, there's a huge risk. Let's just be honest, there's a huge risk. So we cut down on some of the risk by cutting down on the number of TNAs. We've increased the risk by putting more kids to sleep for dentistry, but that's another story altogether. So now we have children who are having less TNAs, and they are keeping their hyperplastic tissues, and they are no longer able to breathe well through their nose. They just can't do it. And come along a few years down the road, and we have a whole new issue with airway. We have a whole new issue with sleep apnea. We have a whole new issue with the fact that the children are mouth breathing, their tongues are forward, and that's creating its own set of problems. And now we have a whole new area to diagnose. And nobody paid too much attention to it until the last few years, although I've been talking about it for years, but it wasn't real popular. Now you have obesity on top of it, and we have a huge issue. Sleep apnea, airway issues have become huge. And that's the reason, doctor, that you're hearing about it, having to deal with it, and wondering why in the world you didn't hear about it a long time ago. That's the reason. Maybe later we'll talk about what can you do early on that might actually help before you have to go through the issues that a child has when they can't breathe properly through their nose. Some thoughts for you today. Good day.